This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
The treaty I examined was the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. This was signed in 1966 and implemented in 1969. My independent variable was the total allowable catch quotas that this commission set up. The reason I'm not doing implementation of the convention itself because it doesn't really set anything up. It just sets up a commission, and their job is to collect scientific data about the 11 tuna and tuna-like species that the convention covers, and then set subsequent regulations that will facilitate maximum sustainable yield for the species. My paper just focuses on bluefin tuna, and what I discovered, they had actually set up so that the Atlantic Ocean was divided into two separate regions along the 45th parallel, the West Atlantic Ocean and the East Atlantic Ocean. And the Commission really didn't do anything until 1981 when it established quotas in the West Atlantic, while it didn't do such in the East Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea. And that provided for some interesting counterfactuals about how the quotas worked and how other mechanisms to control total catch. That's my dependent variable, was total catch of bluefin tuna in metric tons. What I discovered was that total allowable catch quotas were effective at changing the behavior of the actors. It did lower the amount of catch of bluefin tuna in metric tons, as well as kind of facilitating compliance by making it easier for them to understand what they had to do. On the other hand, the treaty really failed in its ultimate goal of creating maximum sustainable yield. This was a big part of this was the fact that the Standing Committee on Research and Statistics of ICAT is really controlled by the member nations and subsequent commercial interests within those nations. A lot of the members of this committee were, for instance, one was a member of the Ministry of Economics or the equivalent in the United States. So it's really a biased group, and the quotas were set much too high. And for these reasons, bluefin populations and catch per unit of effort have just been continually declining in the Atlantic Ocean in both sides. But quotas were definitely one effective at changing behavior, and I'm going to argue that they should be used in a successful conservation effort.
Okay, so the short form is the quotas work, but they have to be the right quotas to be effective. So you can get compliance but not effectiveness.
Another thing is there really isn't any regulation set up in ICAT, and since these quotas are kind of, they are lower than what people would probably want, they don't make it extremely costly. So if there's no regulation, it's really hard to say what would happen.
Okay. Great. I think I will not open it up to questions to get as many people, so at least make sure people have a chance to present. And then if you want, keep some notes and we can come back to people again. So who's up next? Kate? Great. Yeah, and if people can kind of come forward to the extent they feel like they're a natural follow-on, that'd be great.
I've been studying NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, and that's a treaty involving about 12 countries with the purpose of restoring the salmon populations in the North Atlantic. And they also use a system of quotas, which they base on scientific data from this research organization, which is associated with the treaty. and every year they set national quotas for each country. Basically what I found is that once the treaty was implemented, there was a nice correlation, and the rates of catch decreased more rapidly than they had been decreasing before the implementation of the treaty. But what I've also found is that the population of salmon has not rebounded at all, and in fact it's decreased at an increasingly rapid rate. So I'm having trouble deciphering whether the decrease in catch is really a result of the quotas or just a result of the depleted population, which a lot of scientists think is the result of pollution or global warming.
And what's your conclusion on that? I mean, where do you think you'll end up?
Well, from what I've been reading, it seems, I mean, I think the quotas were effective in doing what they set out to do, which was to decrease the catch country by country. But from what I've been reading, it's other problems, which are really the source of salmon problems.
Okay. So this goes back to Risa's kind of argument that the solution has to be the right solution to what the cause of, so you have to understand what the real cause of the problem is.
Right. Okay. I think the treaty was a success in what it set out to do. It had the causal analysis wrong.
Okay.
Pretty much. And on top of that, I was also studying the effect of an NGO which got involved and bought out the quotas in certain countries. And what I found there is that when what the NGOs would do is they'd provide money and economic development packages in return for shutting down the salmon fisheries completely. And I do see zero levels when the NGO got involved. So it did seem to add a level of effectiveness that the treaty alone didn't achieve.
And do you see was the success of the NGOs contingent on the treaty being there? Like, could the NGOs have been as successful if the treaty hadn't been there?
Well, they wouldn't have had this quota system to work with, and this gave them a framework.
Okay, so that it's not, the NGOs get credit, but only within a context in which there was a treaty with quotas there already.
Yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you. Again, this will be brief, but do try to kind of keep track of these things and raise them collectively.
Okay, so I also did something on NASCO, but I was comparing what Risa did with the Pacific Salmon Treaty and NASCO and seeing which treaty has been implemented more successfully. But what I did is NASCO has 3 commissions, and the Pacific Salmon Treaty also has 3 panels. And so the panel that has the most information is the Fraser River panel in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. I decided, since I was comparing the 2 treaties, that I should have the United States and Canada be consistent. And so there's a North American Commission within NASCO, and so I had North America and Canada on the Atlantic, and then United States and Canada on the West Coast. And so then I was just looking at what happened between the fish populations within those 2 jurisdictions. And so, kind of as what Risa had said earlier, is that the Fraser River salmon is a really healthy stock, and they have really good monitoring of what's going on. And so, over the years, it's been stable, the populations. But then, as Kate just said, in terms of salmon in the North Atlantic, especially I looked at populations, I read reports of what's going on in Maine, and the salmon, they're just plummeting. The commercial catch is plummeting, and the number of salmon is plummeting. And I guess you could probably say that the difference between the 2 circumstances is that the Fraser River had a whole lot of scientific data, and they didn't have a habitat problem. But also in Maine, they don't particularly have a habitat problem, but it's just kind of like the salmon have been under such pressure for such a long time that all these little things like global warming and like pollution, they're just kind of killing off the populations regardless of how much, there's a moratorium in places in Canada and there's a moratorium in the United States on catching salmon commercially, but it's kind of I would almost say it's too late for these populations because they've just been hurt so badly. So
how do you, I guess the one part is, where does the habitat as an explanation kick in? I guess, or how do you use a comparison between the cases to help build the habitat argument?
Well, the whole thing in the Fraser River is that habitat is not an overwhelming problem.
Okay.
And then I was reading this report in Maine, and it was talking about 7 rivers, and it's saying that these rivers they don't have a lot of dams and stuff like that, and so really habitat is not a problem in Maine either.
Okay. So therefore, habitat washes out as any explanation of variation between the two. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that then you kind of attribute more. I mean, one thing to be careful of, it was tempting, at least in what you just said, to hear you saying, well, habitat's an important factor.
For the other ones in the Pacific Salmon Treaty, but not
between
yeah.
Fraser River and the others.
Right.
Okay, good. Okay, but I think one thing, so that's good to say, okay, within the Pacific Salmon Convention area, variation across those cases can be explained by the presence or absence of habitat. Between Fraser River and Maine, habitat washes out as a problem, and that's, I mean, don't get hung up on trying to prove a theory, right? In other words, if that's so, then go with that and just say habitat doesn't explain it, and here's what does. And so maybe you attribute it all to the science, the absence of good science in the Maine case, or to a sort of, I mean, you could say habitat's an important problem early on if habitat destruction is a big problem, and at the end, if you've even the mild habitat destruction that is all the farms in Maine, rather than dams, other things, but just farms and small changes in the ecosystem that these fish go to say, when you're down at a really low and very vulnerable population size, then small variations in habitat can kick you over into species loss or whatever. So, which would make sense. If you're a robust system, then small variations in habitat don't matter. If you're a non-robust system, then small variations can make the difference between life or death. So I think just in all the papers, I'd like to see you, even if you're a little bit uncomfortable with it for moral or other, for theoretical reasons, whatever, to just follow your data. To say between Maine and the Fraser River, habitat can't explain it. And then say, but across the Pacific salmon regions, habitat does help explain it. So I think use your cases that way, to go use some factors to explain variation across one case and another source of variation across the other cases. So just don't have to tell a consistent story that explains it all. You can tell different parts of the story for different parts of different comparisons. Okay? Great. Who's next? Alex.
Mine is from all these similar to Eli's about free trade, the effects on the environment.
Okay.
Generally, what I wanted to do was see whether entering a free trade agreement causes a country to comply with the environmental regulations that imposes on its members. Eli did NAFTA, and so one of the largest free trade agreements right now is the EU, the European Union. And so I was trying to find out what environmental regulations and directives they have. One that I did find was in 1988 was in Council Directive 88609, which is the restriction of nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides on large combustion plants after the year of 1988. So then I was trying to decide which countries are EU members and which countries aren't. So I decided to analyze 4 countries. Germany, which has been an EU member since it started in the 50s. And then Spain, which became a member in 1986. And then 2 countries I decided to do that weren't EU members that were in Europe were Romania and the Czech Republic. And I decided to do those 4 countries because based on the EU membership and the long-range transboundary air pollution agreement that was 1979. And I decided to do those 4 countries because Germany was an EU member, and they signed and ratified both protocols of LURTAP, which was the Helsinki Protocol and the Sofia Protocol, in which the Helsinki Protocol asked for a 30% reduction of sulfur emissions of 1980 levels by 1993, and the Sofia Protocol in 1988, which asked to control or reduce nitrogen oxide levels to 1987 levels by 1994. So Germany signed and ratified both protocols. Spain was an EU member, and they signed the Sofia Protocol, yet did not ratify it, and they did not participate in the Helsinki Protocol. And then the Czech Republic is not an EU member, but they signed and ratified both protocols. And then Romania was not an EU member, and they didn't sign either of the protocols. So I thought those were 4 really good countries to analyze. So my specific question was whether Spain and Germany adhered to the environmental regulations that the EU imposed on them. So my independent variables were the EU membership, of course, LURTAP protocols, the provisions of the directive, and lastly were economic effects such as population growth, GNP per capita, and industrial growth. So in my paper, I'm going to talk about theoretical discussion of free trade and the environment and some other stuff. And so my initial conclusion has been for the different countries, Romania, actually both of their levels have decreased after 1989, but that's most positive because of the communism went down in 1989, Germany and Russia. And so there was a big drop of emissions after 1989. So that was for Romania. And for Germany, their levels decreased gradually from 1980 to 1997. And that's specifically because of, I believe, because they're the most strongest EU member. And they have a lot of environmental regulations themselves. And they created a program in 1983. It was an acid rain program, and so they have contributed a lot of money and funding to NOx and SOx. And Spain's a weird one because in the directive they got a pass card sort of for sulfur dioxide, but not for NOx. But they're actually their SOx levels, sulfur dioxide, their levels have gone up, or gone down, sorry, and NOx have gone up. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on with that. It's kind of strange. And then just for the Czech Republic, their levels have gone up and then gone down, and that's sort of a correlation because their GNP also went up and went down. So that's sort of might see a correlation there. And then just some other things that I'm trying to figure out are oil prices and oil consumption and demand, domestic regulations, more efficient technologies for reducing SOx and NOx. And so pretty much my conclusion is that free trade agreements really have a small effect on reducing NOx and SOx compared to political, social, and economic effects. So.
2 things to point here. One is, one of the nice things about something like oil prices, right, is that if you were going to use oil prices, one of the things you can exclude it from, it would be tempting for people to say, well, oil prices are what drove it, right? That, let's say that as oil prices went up, people switched to using coal, which has a higher sulfur content, and that's where the sulfur dioxide came from in power plant use. But to think, whatever that variation is due to oil prices, what's the implication for variation between the Czech Republic, Germany, Spain, etc.? What's the implication?
Well, all the countries would respond to the oil prices.
Same input, so you should get the same predicted output from all 4 countries, unless you think there's something different about these countries with respect to how they respond to oil prices. But the input is the same. The oil prices going in is the same, and therefore your prediction about variation in your dependent variable should be that all 4 countries should respond the same as oil prices. So so when somebody says, well, the difference between Germany and Spain's in terms of sulfur dioxide emissions is due to oil prices, you say, no, they face the same oil market. If they had faced different oil markets, that's something altogether different. So I think keep track of that. The other thing is just the strange data thing, which I think a lot of you are running into. I think Emily came in and we were talking about how do you explain this data I'm seeing, in the Great Lakes. And I think one is, I think that's really good. That, these are not, the thing you're being forced to do is not do cooked up data sets from an econ class here, where the numbers work. This is the real world. The numbers don't work. It's hard as hell to make sense of what's going on out there. And to sort of try to engage that and just deal with it. And it leaves you feeling uncomfortable that you don't have a nice clean answer at the end. But that's like what you'll be doing for the next 40 years of your working life, is not having clean answers and still having to make policy decisions about what to do. Do we, is it good, if you're working for an NGO, is it a good thing to urge countries to get into the EU or not? Will that lead them to be more environmentally clean or not? Or if you're in the EU, what's the right way to write policy? If you're in a fisheries agreement, do you have quotas or not? How do you set the right quotas? How do you get science into the system? So I think you're going to have to make some calls, judgment calls, even in the face of really funky data that it's really hard to make sense out of. But that's the problem. And the solution is not, gloss over it, but to engage it and do the best you can with that hard data. Good, great. Next. Okay. Thank you. That would help. Yeah.
So my topic is actually somewhat similar to that, but I wanted to look at how effective the EU is at generating environmental legislation, specifically in countries which are accessionary to the EU, which means that they're sort of in line to enter. And there are technically 12 of them, but I left out Cyprus and Malta because they're just a big, long, complicated history all of their own. So generally what I ended up focusing on is only the Central and Eastern European countries: Romania, Hungary, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Poland, Latvia, and Bulgaria. And I had the exact same problem that we were just talking about, and almost no consistency across all of those 10 countries. What I did was essentially take the date at which these countries began negotiations with the EU. A lot of them had sort of pre-accessionary agreements with the EU involving a slight opening of trade barriers and starting the process of switching to a market economy and starting the process of developing environmental legislation. I took that date and I sort of theorized that environmental legislation passed after that date could theoretically be attributed to the influence of the EU. There's no guarantee that it was, but there's no way of telling. Of those, roughly half the countries showed that 50% of their legislation was due to the EU. The others showed from 0 to 30% of their legislation being due to the EU. So that didn't help at all. One of the problems with that data set was that the source that I was using only went up to 1999. And that is actually a very large problem because one of the things that I have seen is that the closer these countries get to accession, the more environmental legislation they tend to pass, which is interesting. Environmental legislation seems to be one of the requirements of EU accession, and there are several. The acquis communautaire includes like market economy, protection of rights for citizens in general, environmental legislation, trade barriers, like agricultural stuff. There's a lot. Generally, environmental legislation seems to be sort of the last of those. These countries get everything else out of the way, and when they're this close to acceding, the EU comes and says, that's great, you've made a lot of progress, but here are these 10 environmental laws that you don't have. And so what you see are countries passing 8 or 9 environmental laws in 2 years. Like the report will come out in 1999, and just the next 2 years there'll be this flood of environmental legislation that goes on. And I suspect that it's not adequately enforced. I suspect that there's not really any mechanisms which would allow it to integrate into the governmental system at all, but it does get passed, just sort of all at once. So there wasn't really any clear answer about the effect of the EU. I think it does have an effect, certainly, but not a consistent effect by any means. And I looked at countries, whether they had green parties, whether they were party to a significant number of international environmental treaties, whether they had existing economic and sort of social motivations for certain environmental legislation, like significant environmental problems within their own borders. And I just couldn't get a clear data set across any of those variables. So I think it's just more going to have to be sort of a narrative thing in talking about sort of the general trends and then a couple of the specific exceptions to that, like the Czech Republic. I was talking about, Czech Republic has something like 30 environmental laws on the books as compared to say, Slovenia, which has 4. Like, just the discrepancy is so huge that there's not really any consistency.
Okay. One of the things to think about, too, is that one of the things I'd like you to, all of you to kind of think about is, it may be that this goes to the question of goal achievement versus behavior changing. That the EU may be responsible for only a small fraction, but part of what you should try to do is demonstrate that they were responsible for that small fraction of change, that it was them and not something else that caused the 20% of this legislation to be passed, and 80% would have been passed anyway, but this 20% would not have been passed. So I think keep that part clear. And the other is this point that was raised initially that Ashley started the class with goal displacement. That you pass the legislation, you don't worry about fixing the environment. You just make sure that there's a nice law on the books that, you download something from the EPA's, you're over in the Czech Republic, you download something from the EPA's webpage or the EU's webpage, you convert it into Czech, ramrod it through the Czech parliament and call that done, right? Well, and one is to laugh and say, well, we're really displacing the goal here. The goal is not to kill trees by printing out legislation, but rather to protect the trees. But on the other hand, to say, probably by no means a sufficient condition to have legislation on the books. Probably a necessary condition in most countries. That is, if there isn't a law on the books, probably doesn't get protected. If there is, the likelihood that it's protected is equal to 0 or maybe greater than 0. And so it may be a thing that we need a 50-year study done in the year 2075 or something that says, yeah, getting that legislation in place led to 20 years later a change taking place, and that was important. That sort of what you end up doing is referencing law as a basis for legitimizing your behavior for someone who's elected 10 years from now. And that it forms the basis for environmental protection. Again, that would be something you could further study, but at least to kind of keep in mind that there's sort of two sides, that it's probably necessary but not sufficient, and to keep that clear. Okay, great, thanks. How many other people have yet to present? 3. Okay, everybody else has presented? Great, okay, so who wants to go next? Sarah, Ashley, or Emily? I'll go. Okay, great, thanks, Ashley.
I looked at the Basel Convention on the control of the transboundary movement of hazardous waste, and I wanted to look at whether ratification of the treaty in 1992 caused countries to decrease their exports of hazardous waste. And I guess as of like 6 months ago, there's 143 parties to the convention, so basically, well, it's 142 plus the EU. So basically every country has ratified the treaty within the last 10 years. And I looked specifically at Canada and Denmark. First because they were the original, they were part of they're 2 of the original parties that helped negotiate the treaty. And they're both industrialized because there's a big discrepancy between the industrialized and the developing countries, because the developing countries are the place where a lot of the industrialized countries send their hazardous waste exports. And I found that for both Canada and Denmark, the exports of hazardous waste have been increasing throughout the last 10 years. But when I looked at the rate of the increase, I found that Denmark has been increasing their exports, but Canada has actually been decreasing their exports over the past 10 years since ratification. And so I wanted to kind of look into why that was. And one of the provisions of the treaty says that the convention expects that states take and implement domestic measures to help them comply with the treaty. And I found that Canada has adopted 6 or 7 acts. One specifically was the export and import of hazardous wastes, and another was called the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. And I think that is a big reason why Canada's exports have been decreasing, or the rate has been decreasing even though they have been overall increasing. That's kind of thing.
Okay. And do you see that? How do you interpret the legislation as something that would have happened otherwise, or was a response to Basel?
I think it was a response to Basel because it got 2 of the main ones were adopted in 1992, and the Basel Convention, the initial negotiations were in 1989, even though it wasn't put into force until 1992. So I think that it really got the issue on the table and got them talking about it and discussing it. So kind of the timing of that. And then they've also adopted measures within the last few, like 5 years or so, that I think were kind of to further develop and enhance, like clarify some of the things that industries weren't so clear about.
Okay. And what was happening in Denmark?
Yeah. Denmark hasn't done anything. Okay. There are some EU directives that they're supposed to abide by, but I really think that national legislation is different because it really makes that country take the initiative to do something about it rather than like signing on the dotted line, which is kind of what they all did for the Basel Convention also. But Denmark hasn't done anything. There's no record.
And then how are you explaining the difference between Canada and Denmark then, in how responsive they were to the treaty? Have you kind of engaged that question yet? Of why Denmark didn't respond, basically, and Canada did?
Well, I think part of it is that like lots of countries signed it for PR and political reasons because I think almost every country has signed it. So it was kind of, and there's a lack of enforcement provisions, and the treaty itself there's a lot of vague provisions in it. So it was easy for countries to just sign it and say, yeah, I'll agree and do whatever you say, but knowing that no action was really going to be taken if they didn't comply with the measures.
So what that does is give you a good prediction. Your sort of default prediction is that countries won't comply because nothing happens if they don't. So then the anomaly is not Denmark, which doesn't comply. The anomaly is Canada, which does. And so what explains, sort of how do you explain that then, I guess? So the question shifts a little bit to not explaining why Denmark didn't, but rather that's the expectation. And then so why did Canada respond the way it did, which seems like you're saying at least at a legislative level, going back to the issues that Megan raised, it was fairly responsive. What do you think is different about Canada than Denmark that made it more responsive to international law?
I think the part of it is that export waste has been an issue for Canada. Like, they signed an agreement with the U.S. in the mid-'80s that had to deal with the movement of hazardous waste. And I just think that for them it's always been a bigger issue, that they care about it more than...
Okay, so there was a level of concern there that's not true. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Great. And I think one of the things to think about in terms of, you can get out of the hot seat in a second. One of the things to think about is how do you tell a story about whether this legislation would have passed or not otherwise? And one is the titles of the legislation, right? If you say, what's the counterfactual? Do we expect, in the absence of Basel, that there's a thing called, that there's a law in Canada that's called Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste? There might be a law on hazardous waste, but it doesn't have the same damn title as the international treaty, right? So you could look at the provisions of that legislation as well to say, they might have had some legislation on hazardous waste, but it would have been different legislation. You know, that the level of concern in Canada would have led to legislation against hazardous waste trade, but it would have looked different. This way, they just kind of cut and pasted from the treaty. So I think sometimes you can use the words and rhetoric as a way of getting at what was the causal connection. Okay, Emily, you want to go next? Still talking about Canada and...
Okay. I have some overhead. So I did the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was signed in 1972 between Canada, the U.S., and then it was amended in 1978, 1983, and 1987, and it sort of evolved from focusing on phosphorus in the beginning to now it focuses on like invasive species and toxic accumulations and all this different stuff because there's tons of problems in the Great Lakes. But I decided to focus on phosphorus loadings, and so, okay, so this, I don't know why I put this up, it's going to make you more confused, but, okay, so there's a bunch of different variation that I'm looking at. So the first is a variation in the treaty. Ron sort of talked about my example last week, but in 1972, just lakes Okay, so sorry. The reason phosphorus is important is because it's a limited nutrient in the Great Lakes, and so it's been causing all these algal blooms, which then causes oxygen depletion because when the algae respire, when it decays, it uses up oxygen, and then fish can't live in the water, and it's really bad, and it's smelly, and everyone hates it. So, okay, first you need to know that. But in 1972, just Lakes Erie and Ontario were were regulated for phosphorus, and then in 1978, Lakes Superior, Huron, and Michigan were regulated. So you expect to see, okay, well maybe from the period from 1972 to 1978, the lakes that were regulated went down, and the lakes that weren't didn't go down. So okay, so here we have. The problem is I don't have a complete data set, and I really only have data for all the lakes from 1976 on. But so here, so the top two lines are Erie and Ontario, and it looks as if, and I need to work on this data some more, but from the three lower lines are the lakes that weren't regulated, and it looks like the phosphorus loadings increased before they were regulated, whereas the lakes that were regulated seem to decrease here. I don't know. That's just one sort of part of this project that I'm working on. What's interesting is also that there's this variation in them controlling point source phosphorus and non-point source. You'd think that, so, okay, so let me turn this off. Okay, okay, so I have data that shows that, yes, the treaty was successful in reducing municipal phosphorus loadings into like Lakes Erie and Lake Ontario. But I also have data that shows that in the lakes where, this is all getting confusing. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so I have data that shows that point sources were being addressed and were being reduced in some lakes. But I also have data that shows in like Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron that non-point sources that weren't even regulated were decreasing during a period of time. So it's sort of confusing here. And I don't know what the reason is for that. I also have data that shows that all the municipal effluents decreased from 1972 to 1977, where some lakes weren't even regulated at all. And so I don't know if that's due to domestic policy. There's, in 1972, there was the Water Pollution Control Act amendment that gave a lot of money to increase municipal wastewater treatment plants. And so maybe that, and $6 billion went into the Great Lakes water base, went into the Great Lakes area. So possibly that could explain for that. And I also am looking at all the lakes have very different land use around them. So like Lake Superior, like the reasons that Lake Erie and Lake Ontario were targeted at first is because they have a lot of agricultural lands around them, and they also have a large watershed going into a small lake. So they just have a lot of phosphorus from, fertilizers running off into those lakes versus Lake Superior, which is mostly forested in its watershed. So there's a lot of different issues going on there too. And so possibly it doesn't really, the treaty, no matter what it did, it was not going to be as effective in Lakes Erie and Lake Ontario just because of the land use issues. So I'm sorry, that was very confusing and not very well put together, but I have faith that it will all come together in the end. And
it's a religious experience.
It's very, very interesting, and I'm enjoying working on it. So.
Great. Okay. Great. Thank you. Sarah? Okay, great.
I'm working on the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, otherwise known as CAMLR. And it was put into place this one. One of the reasons that was put into place is this reason. It was established mainly in response to concerns that an increase in krill catches in the Southern Ocean could have a serious effect on populations of krill, other marine life, particularly on birds, seals, and fish, which mainly depend on krill for food. The thing is that krill are these little shrimp-like creatures, and they are the basis of a very short food chain in the Antarctic Ocean, the Southern Ocean, especially. And there was concern that, like, I guess what I could say is, I could start showing you this, and I could say that, see how in 1978, like there's some increases here, and it was getting pretty big. Like this is 400,000 metric tons, and so it started to go up. So everyone's in the 80s or like in the 70s, in this increase, they're like really worried because it is the basis of all this marine life, and if we don't have any sort of system in place to deal with this when the time comes, you know, it'll be bad for the ocean. So in 1982 is when they put the treaty into force. But what they didn't do, they put the treaty into force. Okay, actually, let me tell you something else first, and then I'll go back to that. Now, what CAMLR is trying to do, so they put the treaty in force in 1982. What the treaty is trying to do is an ecosystem approach by saying this is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. They're not saying this is the Convention on the Conservation of Krill or fish or birds or seals, or there's just a seal one. But it's called the ecosystem approach. And so by taking care, like they had to do a certain amount of things, like they had to extend the boundaries from the Antarctic Treaty System because they needed to get the whole entire ecosystem. Like they say the Southern Ocean has a special ecosystem. Anyway, so they're worried about the interdependence of creatures. So that's why I'm focusing mostly on krill, because that's what they're focusing mostly on as the basis of their ecosystem approach, because they're worried about the bottom up and how that affects things. So this is sort of an explanation of that. CAMLR seeks to preserve the health of the ecosystem by setting conservative precautionary krill catch limits to take account of the needs of associated species in a manner which preserves the ecological sustainability. But what happened is that they didn't put any precautionary, in 1982 they didn't set any precautionary krill catch limits. However, there was a big decrease. But then there was an increase again, and they got more worried. And so they actually set precautionary krill catch limits. So interesting, so then you see it go. So they set the krill catch limits, right, in 1991. And then, so you see it go down, and this is 1992, and this data goes all the way to 1988, so it's doing pretty well. But the thing is that the actual precautionary krill catch limits are way up here. Like, this is 400,000, and it's set at 1 million. Or it was set at 1 million in 1991, and in 2000 they extended it to 4 million. And they said that with the measure to be reviewed if catch ever goes above 600,000. So really it's like, is the treaty effective because it lowered krill catches even though the limit is way up here? It's sort of like, what is this treaty doing? What kind of effect is it having? Is it really necessary? And what, let's see. Yeah, so it's just that. So, one of the questions, or actual questions, one of the questions is, so did it get better when limits were actually set? And yes. So I mean, does that mean that the treaty is effective? And then two, like, one of the reasons it's put in place is with the worry that an increased krill demand in the future will really offset this. So how do we know that the Kamler regime will be effective in dealing with that, with an increased economic demand or something that most likely be an economic demand on krill? Maybe this ecosystem approach will create an effective barrier to real exploitation. And I looked at the Antarctic Seals Treaty and stuff like that, sort of, just sort of look at what the difference is between a ecosystem approach and a single species approach and how that would be effective in dealing with a surge. That's kind of proving to be difficult just because like the seals treaty is sort of like a ban, and they're saying that the demand for seals is never really going to rise again because people don't really want seal products anymore, and there's too much like public, outcry about it in the first place. So just judging whether or not this treaty would be effective in dealing with, and also just whether it achieves its goals, and like first of all it achieves its goals, and then how did it affect behavioral change, and what are the actions of countries?
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes left, so I'll make some comments in general about all of the presentations. One, I think it is worthwhile to have everybody present because it gives much more, everybody else much more of a sense that I already have about what people are working on and what your findings are. And actually this year, in comparison to other years, I mean, the thing that strikes me most, actually, is that you all have done incredibly good case selection. And in some of the cases where I'm frustrated in a good sense right now is that, or what I'm anxious about in a good sense is that, will you make good use of the good cases you've selected? That you all have variation in independent variables that's really valuable. So, in Alex's case, to pick ones that are members of LURTAP and aren't members, and members of the EU and aren't, right? That in Henke's case, between the both variation between between Maine and the Fraser River, but also between the Fraser River and Alaska and Oregon, and so different kinds of variation. I think almost all of you has really good variation across your cases. And what, at least to date, I've seen, at least in some fraction of them, is not then kind of tracking that and saying, okay, now I've got to figure out, did LURTAP make a difference or did the EU make a difference? What's the, tracking this difference that I was, pushing Henke with a little bit about, well, what's the difference between Maine and the Fraser River? And if it isn't habitat, then use that as part of your explanation, right? If they both have pretty good habitats, then use that to say the variation is not due to that and it's due to the input of science. And use that as a way of reducing what your counterfactual, your potential explanations is, rather. To say, I can exclude this because it didn't vary across my cases. So I think I'm just, what I'm really struck by and really happy about is that all of you have figured out how to select cases in a world in which you're not doing controlled experiments. In a world in which you're not going in and putting this much fertilizer on one patch of ground and this much fertilizer, and no fertilizer on the other, and seeing what happens. To say, no, I can find patches of ground that have a lot of fertilizer and don't in the natural world, and then compare those. And that's, I think, that I'm really happy with. The other is that you're making the causal connections, that you're trying to find the links and explain why. And that's, I think, a lot of people, working in the world do important things about saying, isn't it too bad the Great Lakes are getting screwed up? And that's great. I mean, it's important to have people out there saying, the Great Lakes are dying, we need to do something. But it's this kind of work that helps figure out what it is to do, what you got to do. And that's, I don't know, that's really important, is getting that connection made. So right now, I'm very excited about, where people are going, it seems like people are going in good places. I'm less concerned. The third point is you've all actually gotten good data. You've gotten good evidence, and you're struggling with the fact that it's not great data. It's good data. It's not fabulous. It's not for the years you want, for the areas you want, on all the variables you want. it's sort of a real mixed grill of things that kind of vaguely get at what you're trying to get at. That's real life. You know, that's what you're going to have to deal with, and you're going to have it on President Bush's office, you know, desk tomorrow. I mean, I don't know if you saw over the weekend this new, he's just laid down the law about a bunch of things. Interesting set of particularly family values. No working weekends, no working beyond 6 o'clock on the White House. You know, he's saying, no, you need time to recharge your batteries, go home, be with the, you know, the husband and the kids or whatever it is, right? You know, but one of the other ones was no memos over 2 pages. and preferably over 1. You laugh, but this has been true for every president for the last 30 years. Presidents don't read things longer than 1 page. They don't. I mean, I was at the Kennedy School 15 years ago, and we had exercises where you'd be in class on Tuesday, and on Thursday, you know, and they'd say, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., it's due. You wouldn't even hear about it until Tuesday morning, 11 a.m., and they say, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., 1 page, do we bomb Nicaragua or not? You know, and it really, and these are people who have worked in the White House, and in the White House, it's 1 page. And if you can't, you know, and if you can't say it in 1 page, I don't have time to read it. And I think it's tempting to think, well, it's just Bush who can't read or whatever. But in fact, every president for the last 30 years has been 1 and 2 page memos. You know, and that's what gets through. And some of them do read longer ones, but for 95% of the policy decisions they're making, they're doing it on 1 page memos. So I think the point is that these 1 page, so all the great data you can do is only going to be one bullet on a screen about what environmental policy should be for the next 10 years, right? So I think you do want to make sure that bullet's the right one, but it's also whether you had data through 1997 or 1999 ain't going to make a hell of a lot of difference in what that bullet says, right? So I think you need to kind of keep track of that.